China, okay? But the United States blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, okay? Blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, which connected which basically delivered gas from Russia to Germany, and it's imposing a trade war on China. So basically, the German economy is about to collapse, and Germans are very angry about this. So the Ukraine war has been a tremendous success for Putin, and it's really shown that America is a paper tiger. And it's also creating a lot of civil dissent in America because the majority of Americans are asking the question, why are we giving Ukraine hundreds of billions of dollars when our people don't even have health insurance? Our people are suffering, and we're giving Ukraine hundreds of billions of dollars, okay? The other thing that this Ukraine war has exposed is that the American empire is overextended. And what I mean by that is that in order to give Ukraine weapons, what America is doing is basically taking weapon systems from in Japan, in South Korea, and other places, and giving it to Ukraine, okay? So America is not manufacturing more weapons, it's just taking other weapon systems it has elsewhere and moving it to Ukraine. So America is badly overextended, okay? And of course, by giving all this money to Ukraine, it's causing American debt to go up. And after Ukraine loses war, this debt will be gone, okay? Because Ukraine cannot pay it back, okay? So, but after the Ukraine war, what happened next was on October 7th of last year, remember that Hamas launched an attack on Israel that killed about 1,000 people. And Israel responded by attacking Gaza. And by doing this, this has helped Putin and has hurt the United States, okay? Mainly by, first of all, diminishing American prestige, right? Because America right now is helping Israel commit genocide. So the entire world is basically turning against America. Even the young people in America are turning against America. You know, these college protests in America, they will only expand in the fall, okay? And the other problem is that America has shown it cannot control Israel. In fact, people say that Israel now controls America. And the third thing is that this war threatens to explode throughout the Middle East, okay? At any point, Iran can enter the battle. Hezbollah can enter the battle from the north, okay? So it's a powder keg. It's like a lake of gasoline about to be lit on fire. So America is badly extended, okay? So, and you can make the argument that either Putin knew about the Hamas attack or even encouraged the attack, okay? Because the main winner of this Hamas attack is obviously Vladimir Putin. And the loser is America, okay? So does this make sense so far? All right. So let's talk about the future, or what are predictions moving forward. So if it is true that Putin's intention is to destroy the American empire by focusing on these three fundamental weaknesses in the empire, and if it is true that he started the Ukraine war to further the deterioration of the empire, if he is the one who is abetting Hamas, then we can predict that Putin will continue to do certain things, okay? The first thing that he will do is he will drag on the Ukraine war. So he will not end it. He will not seek peace. He will not negotiate peace terms. He will continue to drag it on. Okay? Why would he do that? Why not just declare victory? Or why not just negotiate peace? Why would he want to drag it on?
So that the Russian people
Okay, yeah, the Russian people will constantly be at war, but then the question then is, why would he drag it on and not expand it, right? He wants to drag it on, but he doesn't want to expand it. Expand it means he attacks Poland, okay? He doesn't want to do that. He just wants to drag it on. Why? Yeah, okay. So the reason is that Ukraine is turning out to be a black hole for NATO. NATO and the United States is pouring in all this money, weapons, and manpower, and it's just losing it all, okay? So, in other words, Ukraine is a battlefield to increase American debt and create civil discord among NATO and America, okay? Germany does not want to fight this war. Germany wants out. Do you understand? So as long as this war keeps on going, it's going to create more friction between NATO and the United States. And that's what Putin wants. But if Putin attacks Poland, then all of NATO is forced to fight him. Okay? Does that make sense? So he does not want to expand the war. He just wants the war to maintain the status quo and for it to drag on. Okay? So that's the first prediction. Second is that to control the situation in Ukraine, he needs America to fight another war. Okay? He needs to distract America. And the distraction will be Iran. Remember how, for the past few classes, we've been discussing how America wants to attack Iran, and Iran wants revenge against America. Okay? But for this to happen, what Putin needs to do is talk to Iran and guarantee that Iran will be protected by the Russian nuclear umbrella, which means that America will not be allowed to use nuclear weapons when it invades Iran, because Putin will respond with nuclear weapons of his own, okay? Does that make sense? So as long as Putin comes to an agreement with Iran and say that I will use my nuclear weapons to protect you from US nuclear weapons, then Iran will take the initiative and start to provoke America into a wider war. And again, there are many ways Iran can do that, okay? It can use Hezbollah to attack Israel. It can expand its nuclear program. It can disrupt Red Sea shipping, okay? There are lots of ways that Iran can use to provoke America into a full-scale invasion, which is what Putin wants, all right? North Korea. So as the United States becomes distracted in Ukraine and Iran, North Korea can now take the initiative, right? Because what North Korea can do is threaten to invade South Korea. And there are about 30,000 US troops in South Korea. So North Korea doesn't actually have to do anything, but the threat of North Korea will force America to divert resources to South Korea. Does that make sense? Okay? And this will probably even have to force South Korea and the United States to start to bribe North Korea. Okay? And we can expect that North Korea does this because Putin has given North Korea his assurance that he will protect North Korea in the event of a war. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. BRICS. We will see BRICS continue to expand, okay? We will also see BRICS maybe formally announce a new currency or a new trading system to counteract the American-led system. Now, what people have said is that BRICS is not capable of replacing the US dollar. And that is true, okay? But remember that BRICS doesn't have to actually replace the US dollar. It just has to threaten. Because a lot of finance, a lot of money, it's just confidence, okay? You have the US dollar because you're confident that it's valuable. But once you lose the confidence in the US dollar, you will no longer want to use it, okay? Does that make sense? And the last thing is to maintain close relationships, to maintain a very close relationship with China. So Putin will come to China more often, and he and Xi Jinping will hug each other more, okay? They might even kiss one day, who knows, okay? And again, listen, the reality is, if you look at game theory, there are lots of geopolitical differences between Russia and China, much more so than between China and the United States. But again, Putin doesn't actually need China to do anything. All Putin needs is for China not to work with the United States, okay? Because in this situation, one way that the United States can survive or protect its empire is by working with China, right? To triangulate against Russia. Does that make sense? So as long as China remains neutral, then Russia and Putin can continue to exert pressure on the American empire. Okay? So over the next 3 to 4 years, we should see all these things happen, okay? So first thing is the Ukraine war does not end. Putin will find a way for it to drag on, but actually expanding it, okay? That's the first thing. Second thing is Iran takes the initiative against the United States. Third thing is North Korea starts becoming much more belligerent against South Korea and Japan, forcing America to focus more attention in East Asia. BRICS will continue to expand, and then the Putin relationship with Xi Jinping will continue to blossom, okay? Does that make sense? All right, any questions so far before I continue?
Why is China useful for America?
Excuse me?
Why can China be useful for the American?
Okay, that's a good question. So why would America want China's help? Okay, the first thing is you have an overextension problem, okay? You don't want to be fighting too many wars at once. So you come to a peace with China, you don't have to worry about East Asia anymore. Because the real threat from America's perspective is that China invades Taiwan. Okay, that's the first thing. Okay. Second thing is that China is a major buyer of US dollars because of its trade with America and because China buys a lot of oil, right? You want China to keep on buying US dollars so you can sustain the debt. Okay? Does that make sense? And third of all, there are a lot of geopolitical conflicts between Russia and China. If you think about it, Russia is more of a threat to China than the United States is, okay? Does that make sense? Historically, Russia and China fought wars, many wars over the border, okay? So if you become friends with China, then Putin needs to take the defensive and focus more on protecting the Russia-China border. Okay, does that make sense? Because right now, Putin can just focus on the offensive. But if China is on the side of the United States, then Putin is forced on the defensive. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Any more questions? Yeah, Peter?
Recently, I heard China dumped the largest U.S. bonds.
That's right.
In May.
That's right. That's right. So basically, what's been happening is China is now no longer buying U.S. dollars. And it's transferring its US dollars into gold, okay? So China is encouraging everyone to buy gold. Don't buy any more US dollars, guys. Buy gold, all right? And the reason why is because America's debt is a huge problem for America. And the only way for America to sustain its debt is if China continues to buy US debt, okay? Does that make sense? Okay, but that's a great point, Peter. Any more questions before I continue? Okay, so Jack asked a great question. All right, it makes sense for China and the United States to be friends, right? Because China exports a lot of commodities to the United States. The United States is a huge market. The United States also provides China with a lot of technology, right? And Jack asked a question, why would China want to be friends with Russia? And the answer is because China right now feels threatened by the United States, okay? The United States is launching an economic war against China. And if you look at a map, okay, China is surrounded by US military bases. And the problem is that China needs imports of oil and food to sustain its economy. Does that make sense? So if America ever launches an embargo against China, China collapses. Okay? So in other words, China needs to open up new trade routes, and the only way, and the best partner right now is Russia, because it has a lot of access to energy and oil. Okay? So right now, the situation in China is that Chinese policymakers know that the situation in China is terrible. The economy has collapsed. demographics has collapsed. China is completely dependent on the world for oil and food. Okay? China is extremely vulnerable right now. If America says to the world, China is our enemy, then China has no choice but to find a new friend. And unfortunately, the only friend that China has right now is Russia. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. So, but look, I mean, the geopolitical situation for China, it's really, really bad. Okay? Okay. Any more questions before I continue?
Why does the United States think that China will attack Taiwan?
Okay, so Celine asked a great question. Why does the United States think that China will attack Taiwan? And the answer is that America is always looking to start new wars. Okay? It has something called the military-industrial complex. And America is always fighting wars. So to justify all this defense spending, it needs to find new enemies. And it believes that the greatest threat to the American empire right now is China, even though, by the way, there's no evidence this is the case. Okay? Right now, the relationship between the United States and China is China sends America a lot of cheap goods, and the US gives China a lot of US dollars. Okay? So basically what's happening is that the Communist Party is storing the wealth of the Chinese people in American banks. This is a great deal for both America, Wall Street, and the Chinese Communist Party, okay? So there's no reason for these countries to be in conflict with each other, but unfortunately, the American policymakers always need an enemy to justify the incredible amount of money they spend on defense, okay? Does that make sense? Okay, any more questions before I continue?
Who will the U.S. lose if they lose Taiwan in their understanding?
Excuse me?
Like, in their understanding, what will they lose if they cannot take over, like, Taiwan?
I didn't understand the question, so can you repeat that?
Like, the United States think that China will attack Taiwan, and what do they think they will lose if China attacks Taiwan?
Oh, that's a great question. So what happens if China takes over Taiwan? What does America lose? And the answer is like, not that much, okay? You can make the argument that Taiwan has a semiconductor industry, but guess what? You can move that semiconductor industry elsewhere, okay? For America, it's just one of face. You understand? America doesn't really lose anything if China takes over Taiwan. But for America, it's the empire, it has hubris, and therefore it must save face. Right? Does that make sense? All right. All right. So this is Putin's plan to destroy the American empire. And so the question then is, well, this makes Putin a genius. So how is he able to do this? And the argument I want to make to you today is that for many reasons, Russian leaders have a strategic imagination. They just think differently and more strategically than anyone else, okay? And so the example I want to use is Joseph Stalin, because we actually know a lot about Joseph Stalin. All right, so let's look at the world in 1939. And in 1939, there are about 6 global powers, okay? There's Soviet Union, okay? There's Japan. There's United States. There's UK, Britain, the British Empire, Germany, and France. Okay? So this is the map of the world in 1939. Now, let's talk about each country. The United States is far away and it's neutral. It does not like to get involved in the affairs of Europe. But it's suffering from the Great Depression. Its economy has collapsed. Okay? Japan, the Japanese Empire, is a war machine. But the problem for Japan is that it is completely reliant on imports. Okay? It needs oil for its empire, its war machine. And there are only 2 sources of oil close by. There's the Soviet Union Far East, and then there's Southeast Asia. Okay? Now, Japan is getting most of its oil from the United States. But the United States is angry at Japan. Why is the United States angry at Japan? Do you guys know? Exactly, okay, because Japan invaded China. And the United States doesn't want that, okay? So it's very likely that the United States will eventually cut off all exports to Japan. And so Japan has a choice. You can either invade here or you can invade here. But those are your two choices, okay? That's Japan. You can either invade the Soviet Union or Southeast Asia. Okay, the Soviet Union is a communist country. And for the past 20, 30 years, it's been trying extremely hard to industrialize. But it's hard to industrialize because, first of all, no one wants to trade with the Soviet Union, okay? So they can't get any resources. The Soviet Union is still very much an agricultural nation. And the Soviet Union doesn't really have that much technology and expertise, okay? It doesn't really have that much human capital. So the Soviet Union, it's a huge country. It's the world's largest country. It's an empire. But in terms of manufacturing and technology, it's behind the West, okay? Now, in Europe, there are three nations. You have France, Germany, and the UK. The UK is an empire, okay? It has colonies all around the world. Germany lost World War I, and so it has to pay all these reparations to UK and France, okay? And now Hitler is in power, and Hitler is determined to reunite Germany, okay? Because Germany lost a lot of land because of World War I, okay? So he wants to reunite Greater Germany, okay? That's his ambition. It's not to conquer the world, it's to reunite Germany, all right? And then you have France, which is the weakest of all these powers, but it still has an empire, okay? So looking at a map in 1939, and we use game theory, what should be happening, or what should happen maybe 5 years from now, 1945, okay? Let's use game theory to map out what should be happening, or what will happen, given this map, and given the individual players, the interests of these different nations. What do you expect to happen? Who does everyone hate? Who does everyone hate? Who does everyone want to go invade? Why? Why does everyone want to invade the Soviet Union?
It's pretty large, but it's not very strong.
Okay, yes, first of all, it has a lot of resources, and it's not that strong, okay? That's the first reason. But there's actually a better reason why everyone wants to attack the Soviet Union. Why? What's happening internally in the United States right now? The Great Depression. What ideology is a threat to the American government? Communism, okay, do you understand? So there's a global communist movement in the 1930s that's very, very powerful. In fact, in the 1930s, and you guys don't know this, but America was on the brink of revolution, okay? The communists could have any time took over America if America failed to stop the economic bleeding that was happening, all right? So everyone was afraid of communism. Japan would have loved to invade Soviet Union because Japan hates communism, and Soviet Union has a lot of oil, right? So here comes Japan. Germany would love to destroy the Soviet Union because Nazis hated who the most? Who did Nazis hate who the most? Why did they hate Jews? What did Hitler believe about Jews?
He thought they controlled the world economy.
Okay, they control the world economy, but there's actually a better reason why he hated Jews. What's the problem with Jews? Okay, you guys don't know this, but they were all communists, okay? Hitler thought that all Jews were communists. So Hitler hated, first and foremost, communism, okay? Nazism hated communism the most. So Hitler wanted to invade the Soviet Union. How about France and the UK? How about France and the UK? What did they want to do? Who do they hate? Russia, right? Soviet Union. United States? Sure, why not? Okay, do you understand? So 1945, if we use game theory, okay? we should have expected that Soviet Union would have been partitioned into different countries, okay? These powers would have invaded the country together and colonized the Soviet Union and destroyed the threat of global communism once and for all, okay? Does that make sense? But that's not what happened, right? That's not what happened. What happened was that in 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, okay? And when the moment that Hitler invaded Poland, France and Britain declared war on Germany. And then Germany defeated France and Britain, okay? Britain was forced to return to its island, but Churchill refused to seek peace with Hitler. In fact, Hitler tried to seek peace with Churchill 7 times. And each time, Churchill was like, go to hell. We're going to Poland, France and Britain declared war on Germany. And then Germany defeated France and Britain, okay? Britain was forced to return to its island, but Churchill refused to seek peace with Hitler. In fact, Hitler tried to seek peace with Churchill 7 times. And each time, Churchill was like, go to hell. We're going to fight this war till the end. Why was Churchill so angry at Hitler? What happened? Because Germany destroyed the British army, right? It's a complete loss of face for the British Empire. So Churchill was very, very angry at Hitler, and Churchill refused to ever negotiate with Hitler. In fact, Hitler sent this emissary called Rudolf Hess to Britain, to Scotland, to negotiate a truce, and Churchill just put him in prison. Okay? But what's the irony of all this? Germany invades Poland. What does Germany invade Poland? Do you guys know? Have you guys studied this history? Okay, it's because of something called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So this was an agreement between the Soviet Union and Germany to partition Poland into 2. Do you understand? So Germany and the Soviet Union invaded Poland together. The Soviet Union attacked from the east, and the Germans attacked from the west. But what happened was, Britain and France declared war on Germany, but not the Soviet Union, okay? That's pretty clever, Stalin, don't you think? In fact, you can make the argument that if this thing was not signed, Hitler would not have attacked Poland, okay? And the reason why is, the other thing about this pact is that Soviet Union agreed to give Germany resources for its war machine, oil and food and other inputs, okay? Does that make sense? Because remember, the Soviet Union has the Ukraine, which produces a lot of food and oil, okay? Does that make sense? All right? Next thing that happened was that in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa. So Hitler invades the Soviet Union, okay? And if you read history, anyone will tell you that this Operation Barbarossa was a tremendous success for Germany and a strategic failure for the Soviet Union. It was a grave mistake, strategic blunder for Stalin, okay? What did Stalin do wrong? Well, first of all, he refused to defend the border. Okay, there were 4 to 5 million
Economic
Soviet
collapse.
troops
Just a week
at the
away.
border defending the Soviet Union.
Woohoo!
But they were given direct
I'm so happy
orders
about this
to
information.
Economic
Away. Oh,
sorry,
wow.
given direct orders not to provoke the Germans.
Economic
You understand? The Germans fire at you, don't fire back. And because of this order, the German army, which was about 3 to 4 million, was able to overrun the border and almost reach Moscow. Okay? That was a grave mistake on the part of Stalin. Second is that Stalin ignored intelligence. Okay? There was a lot of intelligence that said that Germany was going to invade the Soviet Union. How could you hide the fact that you have 4 million troops assembled to attack the Soviet Union, okay? So there's a lot of intelligence going to Stalin and telling Stalin, hey, the Germans are coming. And Stalin said, nope, I refuse to believe this intelligence. In fact, you had German soldiers desert the German army, swim across the river to the Soviet side and tell the Soviets, hey, my comrades, the entire army is about to attack you. And the Soviets shot these German soldiers because they thought these German soldiers were spies. Okay? So Stalin ignored intelligence. The third thing that Stalin did was, before the outbreak of war, he purged the Red Army, the Soviet army, of its leadership of generals. Okay? So the top generals of the Soviet army, the Red Army, were all dead or in prison because Stalin got rid of them for not being politically loyal enough. Okay? But the fourth thing is, why did Stalin do this? And the answer is, what historians will tell you is that Stalin trusted Hitler. Okay? This was the ultimate mistake that Stalin made. Stalin believed Hitler was his friend. He believed that Hitler would never invade him. Okay? And so this is what you're taught in history class. When you go to the United States, you'll be taught this. When you go on the internet, you'll be taught this, okay? This is completely wrong. This analysis is completely wrong. All right? So we're going to use game theory to understand why this is wrong. All right. So using game theory, let's look at 4 possible scenarios, okay? Scenario A is Soviets attack first, and they encircle Berlin. Second scenario is Soviets attack, okay, and they're stopped at the border. Scenario C is Germans attack, and the Soviets stop them, okay? And scenario D is Germans attack, and they reach Moscow, okay, which is actually what happened, all right? So these are 4 possible different scenarios that could have happened in June 1941, all right? Remember that there were 4 to 5 million Soviet troops at the border, okay? What were they doing there? They were about to attack Germany. The Soviets had a plan to attack Germany, but the Germans struck first, okay? So let's look at these 4 possible scenarios and see what happens. First scenario is the Soviets attack Germany first and they reach Berlin. What happens now? What happens now? What do all the other countries do? Yes, do you understand? Stalin reaches Berlin, boom, Japan comes from the east. Britain comes to the aid of Germany, the United States comes to the aid of Britain. All the world unites against the Soviet Union, okay? So what would happen in this war? The Soviet Union loses this war, do you understand? Okay? Now let's look at B. The Soviets invade, but the Germans stop them at the border. Okay? Now what happens? Now what happens? Yeah, so Japan still invades, okay? And Britain starts to negotiate with Germany and seek a peace. because Britain cannot afford for the Soviet Union to overrun Germany because then communism takes over Europe. Does that make sense? Okay? So in B, we can't say that Soviet Union would lose, but they would not win the war. Okay? You understand? So B is not that good either. Now let's look at C. The Germans attack, and the Soviets hold them at the border. Now what happens? Now what happens? They just destroy each other, right? United States, Britain, Japan, they're all laughing. They're like, oh, they're just killing each other. Who cares? Not a problem, okay? But now let's look at situation D, where the Germans attack and they are about to destroy the Soviet Union. What happens now? The other countries have to come and help the Soviet Union. Why? Why is it the United States and Britain must come to help the Soviet Union? Why? What would happen if Germany takes over the Soviet Union? That's right, okay? They take over the resources, therefore they take over the world. You understand? Because Germany has technology, it has military power, but it lacks resources. You combine the resources with the German military, they're invincible now. The United States will be forever shut out of the world. Germany will not invade the United States, but the United States could never ever attack Germany again. Does that make sense? So what happens is, after the Soviets invade, after the Germans invade and the Soviet army is destroyed, America immediately gives the Soviet Union a lot of aid, okay? It's what we call Lend-Lease. From 1941 to 1945, America gave $200 billion to the Soviet Union for free, okay? It gave weapons, resources, technology, and food. Basically, what America did was industrialize the Soviet Union. Does that make sense? That's what America did. The Soviet Union could not industrialize by itself, but America helped the Soviet Union to industrialize. Let's look at Lend-Lease, okay? Weapons. America gave the Soviet Union 1/3 of all ammunition used in the war. 1/3 of all explosives. 1/2 of all aircraft. 14,000 airplanes. 1/2 of all tanks. 13,000 tanks. Okay? Resources. America gave oil and food. 80% of all copper. 55% of aluminum and steel. Okay? Technology. America gave the Soviet Union radio technology, radio communications, railroad, transportation, heavy industry, and lots of food. Okay? In other words, America basically built the Soviet Union in heavy industry for it. Okay? Does that make sense? And also, at the end of the day, what the Soviet Union can do is reverse engineer all this technology and build its own industry. Does that make sense? Okay? So Lend-Lease really turned the Soviet Union into a superpower. And Stalin could get all this for free because America could not afford for the Soviet Union to lose the war. Okay? What's the other benefit of having the Germans attack first and almost destroy Moscow? What's the other benefit? And Stalin really needed this. This is actually more important than Lend-Lease, which is what? National unity, right? Now all the Soviets were united in the fight against Nazi Germany. Before, communism was tearing the country apart. There was a civil war. The rich people all fled the country, right? But now, because the Germans were invading, the entire country was united against Germany. This is what they call the Great Patriotic War. They were fighting this war for the love of their country, the love of Mother Russia. Okay? So, and what turned the war was the will to fight. The Russians lost 26 million people in the war. That's a lot of people. But by losing this many people, it made the entire nation refuse to surrender. They had the will to fight, okay? Much more so than the Germans. Does that make sense? Okay? So in history, you're taught that Operation Barbarossa proved that Stalin was not a strategic genius, that he was played by Hitler. But if you just do game theory analysis, this was the best possible outcome for the Soviet Union, okay? In 1939, the world should have united against the Soviet Union, but what happened was the world united against Nazi Germany and gave Soviet Union the technology, the money, and the resources to become a global superpower. Right? Does it make sense? And because Soviet Union became a global superpower, it was able to turn China into a communist country. Does it make sense? If the Soviet Union did not become a global superpower with all this heavy industry, then China would not become a communist power. Mao Zedong would not have won the war. Okay? So, in other words, all this is telling us is that Stalin is a genius. He turned a losing war into a winning war. Okay? So, the last thing I want to do is, okay, fine. How was Stalin able to do this? What makes the Russian imagination different from the Western imagination? Okay? So I would say three things. The first thing is just intuition. And intuition means that Putin and Stalin, they're able to read the political winds, okay? They're able to sense the mood of the world. The German word for this is Zeitgeist, okay? Spirit of the times. But they're able to sense the mood of the world, okay? Putin knows that the American empire is about to die. And so he feels emboldened to act, okay? So it's intuition. Second is imagination. So Putin and Stalin both have a strategic imagination, which means like, okay, they sense these winds, but they can also imagine, hey, if I did this, how would these winds change, okay? That's an imagination, to be able to predict or imagine the future. And the last thing, which is the strangest of all, is multiple personalities. Meaning that Putin and Stalin are such brilliant men that they embody multiple personalities in them. And that's why they're so unpredictable. All right? So the example is this. Everyone says that Stalin trusted Hitler. So Hitler played Stalin. But if you just analyze the game, okay, then the conclusion is Stalin played Hitler. You understand? Hitler did everything that Stalin wanted him to do. Hitler invaded Poland, which caused France and Britain to declare war on him. Okay? Then Hitler attacked Soviet Russia, which brought America into the war and helped the Soviet Union become an empire. You understand? So Hitler was completely played by Stalin. And the answer is, so the question then is, how? Okay? Because in June 1941, Hitler did not have to invade Soviet Union, okay? He could have waited for Stalin to invade him. Then the opposite would have happened, right? Then America would have joined the war on Hitler's behalf. And they would have defeated the Soviet Union, okay? So what convinced Hitler to do the most insane thing and invade Russia first? And the answer is Hitler trusted Stalin. Okay, does that make sense? All right? So imagine this. Hitler and Stalin, they're having drinks, okay? They're both drunk. And they're on the porch, and they're staring at the mountains and the moon, okay? And Stalin and Hitler are talking. And all Stalin has to do is say 3 words. And then Hitler is like, I'm gonna come and invade you. What are these 3 words? How can Stalin get Hitler to invade Russia? What are the 3 words that Stalin can say to Hitler? I trust you. Okay? I, Joseph Stalin, trust you, Adolf Hitler. I don't trust anyone. I don't trust my own mother, but I trust you, Hitler. Okay? Then why would Hitler invade?
He thinks Stalin is an easy target.
Exactly, okay? Because Hitler thinks now that Stalin is an easy target, as Jacques says. Stalin is a sheep. I, Hitler, am a lion. I'm a wolf. You're a sheep. Therefore, I eat you. You understand? Okay? But Stalin could only do this if he had multiple personalities. Okay? Stalin had to be a sheep in front of Hitler. He couldn't pretend. He had to be. Does that make sense? Okay? So these 3 things are the Russian strategic imagination. The ability to feel the political winds of the moment. The ability to prophesize and predict. The ability to be multiple individuals at once. And that's how Stalin was able to win World War II, and this is why Putin will be able to destroy the American empire. Okay? Any questions?
What makes the Russians different?
Okay, so Celine asked the most important question, okay? Why are the Russians different? Okay, all right. So the problem isn't Russia. The problem is us, the West, okay? So when we talk about the West, Western thinking, it comes from British thinking. And there are 3 distinct characteristics of British thinking that's different from Russian thinking, okay? All right, let's look at British philosophy versus Russian philosophy, all right? Okay, the first major difference is that British philosophy tends to be narrow, whereas Russia tends to be broad, okay? The reason why is Britain is an island, therefore it thinks very narrowly about the world, whereas Russia, it's a huge country, it's the world's largest country, therefore it thinks very broadly about the world. And to understand the difference, what you do is you read British literature and compare it with Russian literature, okay? Russian literature, you have Leo Tolstoy, right? War and Peace, and A Karenina, okay? These are very huge epics. And then British literature, you have Jane Austen, Thomas Hardy. They're great, okay? But they're very narrow in their focus. Okay, so that's a first big difference. Second big difference is British philosophy believes in the idea of empiricism, okay? Empiricism is a philosophy developed by British philosophers like David Hume. And the idea is we can only know what we experience. We can only know what we see. Okay? So another word for empiricism is the idea of skepticism. Be skeptical of abstract philosophy. Okay? Because we can never know it. For example, you can never really understand mathematics because mathematics is beyond your experience. Okay? You can only know what you experience. Okay? And it's true. But it limits your imagination. Okay? The Russians believe in mysticism. Okay, so they're very spiritual, religious people. So there are forces we don't understand. There are individuals who are prophets, who are sent to us by God. We can never know who they are. We can never know how they think, but we just have to believe that's the case. Okay? So the Russians are going to be much more mystical in their thinking than the British are. Okay? And the last thing is the British believe in logic, okay? It's like mathematics. You can go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, okay? Everything has to be logical. Everything has to be connected together. Whereas the Russians, they believe in intuition, okay? You can jump. You can imagine things. You don't have to be logical. Whereas the British say you have to be logical. And these 3 ideas, narrow, empiricism, and logic, they created the Western mind of today. Okay? So this is what dominates in academia. So when you go off to university, they expect you to think in this way: narrow, empirical, and logical. Okay? And if you think about it, this is perfect if you want to build a bureaucracy, right? This is bureaucratic thinking. This is the bureaucratization of the imagination. Okay? You're not allowed to say things without evidence and logic and experience. Okay? And the Russians don't have this. So they can do this. All right? Now, there's obviously more good things about this system than about this system. But the problem with the British system is like no great man could ever arise from Western society. Does that make sense? Because all this creates a process-oriented, systemized, bureaucratic style of thinking. Okay? So, for example, I give this talk, right? I could never give this talk in America or Britain because they would all think I'm crazy. Okay, does that make sense? They're like, what's your evidence for this? Wait, are you refuting decades of scholarship about World War II? Are you telling me that Stalin was a genius when no one thought he was a genius? How dare you refute these thousands of scholars who have put all this work into World War II scholarship? Okay, do you understand? All right? So, in the British system, no one like Putin can arise. But in the Russian system, someone like Stalin and Putin can arise. The problem, though, is that what happens if you don't have Putin or Stalin? Well, then then this system becomes very weak. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay? So the British system doesn't really need great leaders, but the Russian system, you do need great leaders. And if you are a great leader, then you are allowed to completely follow your intuition and imagination to do great things, like Joseph Stalin in World War II and what Putin is doing today. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. Any more questions?
What is the relationship between the Greeks and the Western today?
Oh, that's a great question, okay? So last semester we studied the Greeks. And the Greeks are more like the Russians than they are like the British. Okay? So the Russian system, the Greek system, it's a much more natural human system. Okay? And the British system, basically, it's trying to remove intuition and imagination from the decision-making process, from the intellectual process, because intuition and imagination are too mysterious. Okay? So in other words, okay, let's just say that I'm Joseph Stalin in World War II, okay, 1939. For me to execute my plan, I need to write a memo detailing my thinking, okay? Now, obviously, I can't do that because if I did that, first of all, I couldn't execute my plan. But second, it would confuse everyone. Like, what are you trying to do again? Okay, do you understand? Okay, and so the Greeks believed in imagination and intuition as well. Okay, but not the British. And we live in the British system. Okay, all right. Any more questions?
So how much did the Greek system influence the current British system?
Okay, so Jack asked a good question. Okay, how much did the Greeks influence the British? And the answer is not that much, because remember, after the Greeks came the Romans. And the Romans were like this, and there was the Romans who influenced the British, who then influenced Americans. Okay, so we're living basically in a Roman world as opposed to a Greek world. Right? Does that make sense? Okay. Any more questions?
So the Greek world is basically gone today, or is it influenced Russia?
This is a really hard question, okay? What influences Russia? Well, I mean, what the Russians will say is that they're a Christian nation, that they come from a Christian tradition. And the Christian tradition comes from a Greek tradition, okay? Okay, does that make sense? So Christianity, they would say that Christianity is the main influence, okay? And there's some Greek elements to Christianity. What the Russians say is that their Christianity is a more pure or more ancient form of Christianity, okay? Because remember, like when we study Christianity, Christianity changed over the centuries, right? So basically, this is a pre-Augustine Christianity, okay? Before Augustine. Any more questions? Okay, great. So next class, we do the American Civil War, okay? Okay, so in this first lecture, I want to ask a question. The question is, why did humanity transition from hunter-gatherer society to agriculture? Okay? And in the traditional paradigm, okay, paradigm is
I'm having homicidal thoughts.
Homicidal thoughts are a form of unresolved anger.
You guys,
Economic collapse.
just a week away.
Collapse.
Week.
a very sophisticated English word, and all it means is story or model or understanding, okay? So in the traditional story paradigm, we transition because we're first hunter-gatherers, and we lived in groups of about 20 to 50 people, and we roam the land looking for food. It was uncertain, it was unstable, and then suddenly there was a revolution. We discover farming, and farming provided a stable source of food that we could control, okay? The word we use is domestication. Okay? Domestication just means that we bring it under our control. And because of farming, we can now create more food than we need. And the word we use for this is surplus. And because there's a surplus, people now could do things besides farming. So for example, we could have leaders, which creates the idea of politics, right? We could also have priests, which introduces the idea of religion. And then we can have creative people, which then gives us arts. And slowly over time, these villages grew into cities. And because there was a lot of people in our surplus, we could now have literature, reading and writing. So we can now store knowledge and then pass it from generation to generation and across cultures, okay? We can now have science and technology. And slowly, over the course of this process, we create modernity, okay? Which is the world that we live in today. So the pivotal step towards modernity was this transition into agriculture. And this is traditionally what we believed about the world. Unfortunately, there's no evidence for this, okay? And in fact, the more evidence we collect, the more we realize this is not true. In fact, what we now know is it was actually pretty stupid to transition from hunter-gatherer into farming, okay, for a variety of reasons. The first reason is that when you're a hunter-gatherer, it's actually a pretty easy life because there's food everywhere, okay? When you're a farmer, it's a hard life because you have to grow that food. So maybe as a hunter-gatherer, you're working maybe an hour a day, but as a farmer, you were working 6-7 hours a day. It was very hard to grow that food. So in the book *Sapiens*, the Israeli historian named Yuval Harari, he's very famous. *Sapiens* is also a very famous book. There's a very famous sentence, okay? And the sentence is like this: we did not domesticate wheat. Wheat domesticated us, okay? So we thought that we made wheat, okay, the food wheat, into our slave. But in reality, wheat made us its slave. And the reasoning for this is this. Out in nature, if you're wheat and you want to survive, you have to make yourself attractive to other people and to animals, okay? So you have to be tasty, and you have to be easy to find. You have to do a lot of work. But when you're on a farm and you're wheat, you can just lay back, do nothing, and make humans do all the work. Okay? So it was a bad deal for humans and a very good deal for wheat. Okay, so that's the first problem. You actually do more work on the farm than you do as a hunter-gatherer, which means that now you have to have more children, right? You need to have labor to do all that work, which creates a problem of overpopulation, which means that you are using too much land, and then eventually the land becomes dead, okay? Or not arable anymore. So that's the first problem. Second problem is that we're able to dig up the skeletons of hunter-gatherers and farmers. And what we see is that hunter-gatherers are a lot taller than farmers. Why? Protein, right? Food. As a hunter-gatherer, you have access to meat. You have access to fruits and nuts and vegetables, okay? Your diet is varied and very nutritious. But as a farmer, you're eating only what you grow, which is mainly wheat and some vegetables, okay? So you're not getting that much nutrition. Then the third problem is as a farmer, you are much more likely to die early than if you're a hunter-gatherer. Why? Have you guys been to a farm? What's the problem on a farm? Exactly, thank you. Pigs, right? Animals. They're everywhere. Plus, where do you put the garbage? Where do you go to the restroom, right? So because people are together in a very unclean place, it's much more likely to contract disease and then die. Okay? So for these three reasons, the transition from hunter-gatherer to farming makes no sense. And even today, we are not able to explain to you why this transition happened. Okay? We don't know why we did this. So the only thing we can do is construct theories as to why this might have happened. So even though we can't go in the past and look at why we did this, we can do some research and collect evidence and then create theories as to why this might have happened, okay? So there are 4 different disciplines from which we can collect evidence. The first discipline is called archaeology. Archaeology is just the study of the past. So basically you go and you dig stuff up and you see what you can find, okay? Maybe you can dig up someone's house, or you can dig up someone's skeleton, or someone's clothing, okay? And from that, you're able to figure out what happened in the past. And so 3 pieces of evidence from archaeology we will look at today are Göbekli Tepe, Jericho, and Çatalhöyük, okay? And these are places that we've actually dug up, and we know what life is like in these 3 places. So that's archaeology. Second discipline we can look at is anthropology. And anthropology is the study of other cultures. So in other words, there are places still on this planet where people live a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Maybe in the Amazon, maybe in Australia, maybe in Africa, okay? And so we're able to go and study these people to understand why, or how originally we thought, and why we might have transitioned into farming, okay? So anthropology. The third field that we can look at is psychology or neuroscience. Basically, how the brain works. How do we feel? What motivates us? Why do we behave the way we behave? Okay, so that's a third field we can look at. The last field we can look at is primatology. The study of primates, okay, or monkeys. Because guess what, guys? We're monkeys. We're primates. 99% of our DNA are monkey DNA. So we can look at certain groups of monkeys to understand how they behave. And there are 3 types of primates that we look at very closely. Okay, the first is gorillas. We also look at chimpanzees, and we look at bonobos. Okay, chimpanzees and bonobos are very close to us. Genetically, they're the closest to us of all the primates. So by looking at these 4 different fields, we're able to collect evidence to construct theories as to why we transition from hunter-gatherer into farming, okay? So now I will share some of these theories with you. And again, what's really important to understand is we don't know what happened. We can only guess about what happened. So the first theory is the idea of coercion. Okay? And what this basically means is that there's an elite group of people who didn't want to work. So they made everyone else work. Okay? So that's coercion. And the evidence for this is that, well, guess what? Gorillas do this, right? If you study gorillas, you will see that they always have an alpha male. The male who's bigger than everyone else and who makes everyone do all the work. He just sits and naps every day, but he gets all the girls and he gets all the food. Okay? So gorillas. That's the first theory. The second theory is war. Okay? And the idea here is that if you are on a farm, it's easier to protect yourself in a time of war than if you're out in the forest, right? You can build walls around your farm. You can defend yourself a lot easier. You can see the enemy coming. Okay? So, war. The evidence for this is that chimpanzees, okay, again, who are like us, they go to war a lot. They're very violent. They're always fighting each other. So the argument here is that we human beings are just a violent people who are always at war, and we must be afraid of each other. And therefore, when we have the chance, we'll settle down, build fortifications, build walls, and fight each other, okay? That's the second theory. And again, the evidence for this are chimpanzees. The third theory is respect for elders. Meaning that as a hunter-gatherer, it's very hard on old people, right? So at a certain point, you're going to have to leave the old people to just stay there and die. And maybe we as human beings, we are biologically programmed to take care of elders for whatever reason, okay? And again, the evidence for this is anthropology, where every culture respects its elders, right? So that's a third theory. The last theory is religion. Okay? Meaning that we settle down in order to celebrate a religion, to practice a religion. And just to be clear, there's evidence and arguments for all four theories, and there are scholars who argued for different theories, okay? But the consensus, what most people agree on today, okay, most scholars, not every scholar, but most scholars is
What's up, everybody on Patreon?
Religion, okay?
Awesome to have you here.
So let me explain why we think the answer has to be religion, slowly. All right, okay. So, coercion. While it is true that with gorillas, there's an alpha male who controls everything, the problem is that if you look at gorillas, the alpha male is huge, okay? And males are a lot bigger than females. So it's possible for one gorilla to exert force and pressure on the others, okay? With human beings, that's harder, right? Because let's just say a 9-foot giant human being comes into this room and is like, I'm now your boss. You have to grow food for me. You have to give me all your women, okay? What can we do as a class? Beat the crap out of him, okay? You understand? Because we have big brains. And these big brains allow us to cooperate together, okay? So this guy's around, and at first we're afraid of him, so we let him do whatever he wants. But then he goes to bed, and then we as a class discuss, hey, what can we do? Well, we can make weapons, right? Or we can trap him, or we can trick him. We can give him poison food, okay? So coercion among humans is very, very hard to do. The worst case scenario, we can't beat them up. What we'll do is just run away. Okay, does that make sense? So we don't think coercion is an explanation because there's so many ways for us to fight back and to rebel against bigger people, okay? So coercion doesn't really work. War.
I'll start pulling up as well.
Okay, so we don't think war is a good explanation
Yo,
either.
All right, all right.
So it is true that chimpanzees are naturally violent, okay? They're always beating the crap out of each other. But guess what? Bonobos, who are actually closer to us genetically than chimpanzees, they're actually very peaceful. They don't fight each other, okay? So there's no evidence that we human beings are naturally violent. Also, if it is war, then we should be able to find weapons. And we don't really find weapons, okay? In archaeology, we don't really find weapons of early humans. Now, there is a lot of violence in early human history, okay? There's human sacrifice, there's group burials where a group of people are killed, but that's basically violence within a group. We don't find evidence of large violence among different groups, okay? We don't find that. So war, we don't really think is a possibility. Now, it's possible that in the future we'll find evidence. But I'm just saying that right now, in archaeology and anthropology, we do not have any evidence, okay? Then we look at respect for elders. And even though this is a valid theory, there's an argument that back then they didn't really care about dying that much. And the reason why is that for most of human history, we human beings have seen life, history as a circle, right? So for example, right now it's summer, it's gonna turn into fall, then winter, then spring, then summer again, okay? So the world, history, moves in a cycle. Well, human life also moves in a cycle. You're born, you die, then you're reborn, then you die again, then you're reborn again, okay? So back then, they really didn't care if you died. In fact, if you're an old person, you're probably like, you know what, I'd rather be dead, and then, so if I die, I'll either be reborn or I'll go into the spirit world, okay? So they didn't really fear death, or they really didn't see death like the way we saw death, yeah? Okay, that's a great question, okay? So the evidence for this is what we understand about their religion, which we will discuss later on and in next class, okay? All right. So that leaves religion as the most likely possibility. And this is what most scholars believed happened. And so we're going to look at 3 different archaeological sites. The first is Göbekli Tepe. The second is Jericho. And the third is Çatalhöyük, okay? All right. So I'm going to draw up a